Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. Today we're looking at the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In our last two sessions, we've seen that Paul talked about our freedom in Christ. We are free in Jesus. And he said we are to use our freedom to do everything we can to win people for Christ. And then he followed that up by saying, and in our freedom, we practice spiritual discipline to hold ourselves true to Christ. And then he closed chapter 9 by saying, I do this, lest after I have preached to others, I myself might be disqualified. And then he follows it up at the first part of chapter 10 by giving a warning, an example from the Old Testament of how the Israelites who went through the Exodus lost their way and ended up losing their right to the promised land. They serve as a warning to us. Let's read what he says in chapter 10. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They're talking about they were following the cloud of God's presence, and passing through the sea was the great deliverance through the Red Sea, when God opened the waters and brought Israel out of slavery, and the Egyptian army that pursued them was destroyed. Now, those ancient Israelites had passed through the sea. They had seen God's great saving power, and they had experienced it. Paul goes on. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food, that is the manna, and they drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. You remember the water that flowed from the rock? They drank from the rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things, as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. So he talks about the example of those early Israelites who experienced the wonder of salvation in the Exodus event. And yet, do you remember? No one in that first generation entered the promised land because they did not continue to believe, they did not continue to be faithful, they rebelled. And of that original generation, only two would ultimately enter the promised land. That was Joshua and Caleb. Most of them had to die in the wilderness. You see, they began well. They experienced the delivery from Egyptian bondage, but they did not continue well. They lost their trust in God and began to doubt, and that led them into rebellion. And so all of that first generation perished in the wilderness, the 40 years of wandering. Only Joshua and Caleb, who believed, were allowed to enter the promised land from that first generation. So Paul says this is an example to us. We've experienced the saving grace of Christ, but let us continue in our faith. That's why we practice the spiritual disciplines, to hold ourselves true to who we are in Jesus, true to the saving grace we've experienced through faith in Him. Let us hold ourselves true. Keep believing. Lest, like the ancient Israelites, we begin well, but do not continue well. And so Paul says, hold fast to your faith, hold fast to your confession, and do not follow their example of losing your way. So we read that tragic story in the Old Testament, and Paul says that's an example to us. We've experienced the power of God. Let us continue to walk in His power. It's all by grace. It's all through faith. But we must hold to our faith in Him. Continue to walk by trust in Him. That's why we practice the spiritual disciplines, to keep ourselves true to Jesus and to keep our faith in Him strong. May it be so, always. Hope you join us tomorrow as we continue our study of 1 Corinthians. Tomorrow we'll move into the next section of the book, which is chapter 11, and Paul begins to answer some of the Corinthians' questions about worship and the protocols and the rituals of worship, how you should do worship in the church. So we'll begin that tomorrow in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Hope you'll join us for that next session of our 5-minute Bible study.